In 1955, Albert Einstein, hailed as the greatest scientific mind of the 20th century, died. For the next 26 years, Einstein's literary estate lay guarded in the basement of Princeton's Fuld Hall. The Sentinel was Einstein's loyal secretary of 50 years, Helen Dukas. A condition of Einstein's will was that upon her death, all his papers, some 45,000, would go to Hebrew University in Jerusalem.
It was a dark and rainy night in December, and I happened to be just coming out of my office on my way home, and I saw this convoy of trucks drive up to the Institute, and some heavily armed Israeli soldiers with them. Then they rushed up the stairs, and big boxes began coming down the elevator, and the soldiers began loading them onto the trucks. So I knew what was happening. It was the archive being carried away, and that was it. And the next day they were in Jerusalem.
Buried deep within these vast archives was an unpublished manuscript. This led to the discovery of secret love letters written by Einstein to a first wife, who was also a physicist. When finally made public at a major North American science convention, the content of these letters rocked the international science community.
And I found these historians who were having a violent argument about whether Einstein's first wife, Mileva Maric, had somehow been cheated out of the credit for inventing relativity. And I was stunned.
I don't think the structure of the human skull is to be blamed for man's inability to understand the concept of infinity. He would certainly be able to understand it if, when young, and while developing his sense of perception, he were allowed to venture out into the universe.
Mileva Maric was born on the 19th of December 1875 in Hungary, in the small town of Titel on the outskirts of Novi Sad. Her father is a civil servant and prosperous landowner. Mileva, born with a congenital dislocation of the hip, is painfully shy, but exceptionally gifted. A teacher tells her father, "Watch that child. She is a rare phenomenon."
She must have been, in many ways, a very remarkable young woman coming from a sort of backwater area of the Balkans, Vojvodina, which at that time was part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. She had the encouragement of her father, and it seems very often at that time that there had to be a father who was pushing for a young woman to get advanced education. Her father gave her the best education possible in Serbia at that time.
Miloš obtained special permission from the government for Mileva to attend the all-boys Royal Classical Gymnasium in Zagreb. Here she is able to study mathematics and physics, subjects not available to young girls.
She was trying to break barriers in mathematics and science in a way that women and girls certainly just did not do.
Mileva matriculates, topping her class with the highest marks in physics and maths. Her next stop is Switzerland.
not admitted to most universities in Europe. So Zurich was one of the few options she had.
Mileva enrolls in one of Europe's leading technical universities in Switzerland. The only woman in a class of 5. She decides to specialize in theoretical physics. Only one other person does the same: the young Albert Einstein. As the only 2 students taking the subject, it was inevitable the forces of attraction would be strong.
He's clearly fascinated by her. She speaks of being from the land of pepper, Pfefferland, and it's clear that he enjoyed her, to some degree, her exotic character. But the important thing is the toughness and the independence, the fact that they were 2 bohemians against a Philistine world.
He sort of grew up surrounded by these kind of bourgeois, stuffy women that he was always complaining about. And well, fluffy people. So suddenly, here was this woman, Mileva, a serious intellectual science student, and he'd never seen anything like this before.
It is a time of great intellectual ferment in the world of physics. The marvel of electricity is new to the world. Big business is pouring money into research institutes. The race is on to discover the laws of natural phenomena.
Electricity at the turn of the century was sort of like computers are now. It was the hot new technology. Everybody wanted to be a player. Everybody wanted to use it and make money out of it. Nobody actually knew yet exactly what it was. They didn't know what matter was made out of. They didn't know what light was. And because Einstein's family was in the thick of it, because his father and his uncle had an electrical business in Munich, and then they moved it to Italy. And so Albert was very much involved. He grew up surrounded by this hot new technology called electromagnetism.
It is not until the latter half of the 19th century that electricity and magnetism are vigorously pursued in the laboratory. What is it that makes the compass needle point north? Is electricity a fluid? Science is going beyond Newton's theory of gravity, of solid objects in space, into a world of invisible forces that nobody can explain.
In addition to great theories, there were great experiments, X-rays, electrons, radioactivity. Wherever you looked, there were marvelous new things going on. And the great debate whether in the long run, when physics is all over, it'll all be mechanics, as Newton had dreamt, or whether it'll be electricity and magnetism, which explain each other. These were the 2 opposite camps.
This new world lights the path to Albert and Mileva's future work.
She had many of the same labs and had much of the same coursework as Einstein. It's well known that Einstein, of course, did not attend many courses, but was able to use the notes from his good friend Marcel Grossmann. And my view of Mileva, that she was a much more orthodox student in that she did attend classes, and however successful or not, she was, she took her coursework very, very seriously, as she took everything very seriously.
The first year at university ends well, with Albert and Mileva passing their exams easily. But unexpectedly, Mileva abandons Zurich and Albert, and instead heads to greener scientific pastures. Heidelberg University, the oldest and most prestigious university in Germany. It is months before Mileva replies to Albert's letters.
Mein liebster Albert, it's been quite a while since I received your letter, but you said I shouldn't write until I was bored, and I am very obedient. I waited and waited for boredom to set in, but until today, my waiting has been in vain.
At Heidelberg, Mileva studies with one of the great pioneers of quantum physics. Working mathematically, Lenard is attempting to prove the existence of molecules.
Philippe Lenard was probably the leading German experimental physicist of the time, and he had done a very interesting experiment. He shined ultraviolet light on a piece of metal and found that electrons would bounce out of this metal. This is called the photoelectric effect.
Mileva is enthralled and keeps Einstein abreast of this brave new world.
It really was so enjoyable in Professor Lenard's lecture yesterday. It seems that oxygen molecules travel over 400 meters per second, and the good professor set up equations, differentiated, integrated, substituted, and finally showed that the molecules in question do move at such a velocity, but they only travel the distance of a hair's breadth.
But women are not allowed to graduate from Heidelberg, and Albert badgers her to return to Zurich.
Come back very soon. I'm sure you won't regret your decision. I'm convinced that you will be able to catch up rather quickly on our most important coursework.
When Albert and Mileva really were publishing, they took the data that Professor Lenard had developed and developed a theory which forms part of the foundation of quantum mechanics. Very, very significant, but she was the one with Lenard. It suggests that indeed she brought back much more than herself to Albert Einstein.
Mileva's return to Zurich University coincides with Albert's disenchantment with his physics professor. He is critical of Heinrich Weber, who represents the old school. Albert and Mileva begin cutting classes, burying themselves in books.
Dear Fraulein, if you don't mind, I'd like to come over this evening to read with you.
Mileva and Albert are keen aspirants to the more radical ideas. They are trying to solve the puzzles of the universe in mathematical form. Amongst the new breed of physicists being read by them are Michael Faraday and James Clerk Maxwell.
Faraday intuited, being a person without much mathematics, that the way to think about much of physics is to think in terms of fields, in terms of lines of force, both electric and magnetic ones. And that's an idea which Maxwell takes seriously, for the first time being really taken seriously.
Maxwell put the equations that described electricity and magnetism together and found out that they could combine as a wave, and predicted that light was actually a wave, and that it should travel at a certain speed, and that radio waves, light waves, were all the same phenomenon. And Einstein came onto the scene, and he was very taken by Maxwell's theory, and he studied it on his own because it was not taught at the Polytechnic where he went to college. Electromagnetism was too avant-garde.
A new chapter in physics is being written, and Mileva and Albert work together constantly, relying on their keen and open minds, where pen and paper replace the laboratory. By their third year of study, the young couple are spending so much time together, friends begin to comment.
Albert spends a lot of time at Mileva's apartment. Anyone would think they were married.
The girlfriends were a little jealous because Mileva spent so much of her time with Albert. It was a relationship that was very passionate initially, certainly more passionate than most relationships between a young man and a woman would have been at the turn of the century. It was a relationship of equals in many ways. They shared this great intellectual adventure together, as well as a love of music and a love of the outdoors and going hiking together, and obviously a great physical affinity.
My dear Johnny, because I like you so much, I'm writing this letter to ask you if you like me as much as I do you. Answer me immediately. 1,000 kisses from your Dolly.
Oh my, that Johnny boy, so crazy with desire. While thinking of his Dolly, his pillow catches fire.
Johnny and Dolly were endearing names. He used very endearing names, and they were creative. They show really their fun they had together and their creativity by inventing names. Schnocksel and Dolly and Doxel.
The cramming proceeds slowly. Can I also ask you to leave your notebook on heat theory with Frau Markwalder? I want to look up a few things. Your Dolly.
October 1899. Dear sweet Dolly, now that's a nice way to behave. You've already been comfortably taking your exams for 4 days now, and I, your good colleague and fellow coffee guzzler, have yet so much as to hear a peep out of you. Isn't that shocking? And if the girl says that you've gone out and I see your little boots at the door, as sometimes happens, then I'll just wait a little more. Or go get a shave.
Albert and Mileva choose the same topic for their diploma thesis, thermal conductivity, each approaching the subject from a different angle. The young couple are now inseparable.
My dearest Johnny.
Dearest Dolly.
Your doll.
My street urchin.
Your veranda.
My little witch.
Your little witch.
My everything.
Mileva writes to her closest girlfriend, Helena Kaufler.
He is my only companion in society, and I am happiest when he is beside me.
And she shares the latest news about her studies.
Professor Weber has accepted my proposal for the diploma thesis. I am very happy about the investigations I'll have to do. I embrace you, Mitza.
Mileva would remain close to Helena all her life. But for now, Albert and Mileva's habit of skipping classes to pursue their passion for the new world of physics sees them fail their final exams. But the Board of Examiners round Albert's mark to a pass.
When we say that Einstein got through with 4.91 and Mileva did not with 4.00. Because first of all, you would get through today with 4.00, it would correspond to C. So my explanation is that somebody simply said, well, Einstein already has his diploma and she doesn't need one. One is enough in the family.
Albert joins his parents in Melchthal. He must first confront his mother with the news of his poor marks and the truth of his relationship with Mileva.
I went into Mama's room, just the two of us. First, I have to tell her about the examinations. Then she asked me quite innocently, "So what will become of your Dolly?" "My wife," says I, equally innocently, but prepared for a real scene. This ensued immediately. Mama threw herself on the bed, buried her head in the pillow, and cried like a child. She then switched to a desperate offensive. "You are ruining your future and blocking your path through life. This woman cannot gain entrance to a decent family. If she gets a child, then you'll be in a pretty mess." At this last outburst, my patience finally gave out. I rejected the suspicion that we had been living in sin with all my might, and scolded her properly. "If only I could be with you soon again in Zurich, my little sweetheart. Colossal kisses from your Johnny."
Alas, these don't seem to be very favorable for me. Do you think she does not like me at all? Did she make fun of me really badly? Do you think she does not like me at all?
Einstein's mother thought there were absolutely no redeeming qualities to this relationship. Mileva was entirely unsuitable to be a wife. She was not attractive, she was lame, she was, as the mother said, a book, and you deserve a wife. she said to her son. And she was not Jewish.
And it was fine for him to kind of hang out with her while they were students, but the fact that he was this nice Jewish boy was actually going to marry that slut from Hungary was just unconscionable.
With degree in hand, Albert qualifies to teach secondary school. But the duo crave the academic world. For this, they require a doctorate. Mileva is given permission to retake her diploma exam and study for her PhD.
19th of September, 1900. Dear Dolly, you must continue with your investigation. How proud I will be to have a little PhD for a sweetheart.
But Albert faces real financial difficulties. He must find some way of earning money to be able to continue his studies, and no professor, least of all Weber, will employ him. Adding insult to injury, Professor Weber offers Mileva the position instead.
With Weber, we must try to get on good terms at all costs, because his laboratory is the best equipped.
It is Mileva's access and good standing with their professor that keeps their private research alive. As well, Mileva's father supports her financially. The household survives on the patronage of these two men and is fueled by coffee, music, and physics.
We will try to get some empirical data on the subject of capillarity. If this yields a law of nature, we'll send the results to Weidemann's Annalen.
Einstein's first paper, strange enough, was on capillarity. Now what is that? You know, when you take a very thin straw and put it into a liquid, a bit of the liquid rises inside the straw. Now that's really curious. And Einstein said, there is a puzzle here. Things fall, generally. They don't rise by themselves. Is there something in nature which makes a difference between the general affairs and what goes on in a thin straw? It can't be. I must find a way of understanding both together. So his first paper was on that subject, to try to explain capillarity, when everybody else who needed a job was working on X-rays, on electrons, and radioactivity, and all the things which get you jobs. No one could get a job with capillarity.
The publication of this paper is their first major academic achievement. But the extent of Mileva's contribution continues to be contested.
It's very conceivable that Mileva had input on the paper on capillarity. That, of course, has nothing to do with special relativity. But I think it's fair enough to say that Mileva contributed, could conceivably have contributed to this very first paper of his.
Early in 1901, the idyllic days of Zurich are drawing to a close. Albert's parents order him home to search for a job. He reluctantly leaves, but writes constantly to Mileva, confident their research will bear fruit.
I long for you every day. Without you, even studying only gives me half the pleasure.
1,000 kisses from your Dolly.
I'm also looking forward to working on our new papers.
If only we could start tomorrow.
I'll be so happy and proud when we are together and can bring our work on relative motion to a successful conclusion.
We'll send the results to Weidemann's Annalen.
I think there is enough empirical material for our investigation.
Albert is desperate to reunite with Mileva and organizes a rendezvous in Italy.
You absolutely must come to see me in Como, you sweet little witch. It will take up very little of your time and will be a heavenly joy for me.
On the 5th of May, I went to Como, where a certain person waited for me with open arms and a pounding heart. It was the most beautiful spring when we were there. We did not even suspect that we should be riding through snow flurries the very next day. I held my sweetheart firmly in my arms under the coats and shawls with which we were covered.
How delightful it was to press your body to mine the way nature intended. Let me kiss you passionately for it, my dear, sweet spirit.
Albert leaves to take up his teaching position in a small town in Switzerland not far from Zurich, while Mileva returns to university to retake her diploma examination. But all is not well.
Cheer up and don't fret. You are my best and dearest sweetheart, come what may.
Mileva is pregnant. Suffering severe morning sickness, she is terrified of discovery by the examining board. Against the odds, she fights on, but fails the same subject, theory of functions. She withdraws her dissertation and returns home to Hungary to face the music.
It must have been utterly devastating, and even her parents, who had been very supportive of her as a young, promising student, must have been appalled. And that disappointment would have been the ultimate injury to Mileva.
When Albert's mother hears the news, she writes a scathing letter to Mileva's parents. Mileva is devastated.
Oh, Helena, I wouldn't have thought that there could exist such heartless and outright wicked people. It caused much suffering to Albert and myself.
Fearing his mother might drive a wedge between them, Mileva travels for 3 days to see Albert in Schaffhausen, Switzerland. The young couple are so terrified of discovery that Mileva stays one village away.
And he leaves her to sit there for several days. Now, he has excuses. He claims he doesn't have the money for the train fare. Perhaps he's busy, but it's several days before he actually manages to get to her little hotel. And we can only imagine what that must have been like.
My dear naughty sweetheart, now you're not coming tomorrow again. And you don't say you're coming on Sunday instead. I'm very curious what Kleiner will say about the 2 papers. He'd better pull himself together and say something reasonable. Have you read the article by Plunk yet? I'm going to write to Helena. I don't think we should say anything just yet. But you will have to help us with something important later.
Albert finally arrives, and reassured of his love, Mileva returns home, but is taken ill and ordered to bed. A daughter is born in late January 1902, and they name her Liesel. It is a difficult birth.
I was frightened out of my wits when your father's letter came because I had already sensed something wrong. But now you see that it really is a Liesel, just as you wished. I love her so much and don't even know her yet. Tender kisses, your loving Johnny.
Supremely confident, Albert throws in his teaching job and moves to Bern in Switzerland. While waiting for a vacancy to come up in the patent office, he advertises as a tutor to help pay the bills. His friends are soon in town, and he starts discussing plans for his doctoral thesis, an action which obviously threatens Mileva.
My little sweetheart, don't be jealous. What are they to me compared to you? I long for you every day.
The one option she had once she failed the second round of exams, and failing the exams as a pregnant woman, was the relationship with Einstein, because here she had a partner with whom she could not only talk science, but do science.
My dear sweetheart, the only problem that still needs to be resolved is how to keep our Liesel with us. I wouldn't want to have to give her up.
Einstein was up for a job in the patent office, and he was already considered a sort of weird case, a weird nut in Swiss physics, and it was a very small world, and so this would have been beyond the pale for him to show up with an illegitimate child.
For the time being, Mileva leaves Liesel in the care of her parents and rejoins Albert in Switzerland. In July 1902, Albert starts his job as third-class examiner in the patent office. Within 6 months, they marry.
And with you as my dear little wife, we are finally able to work diligently on science together, so we don't become old Philistines, right?
Dear Helena, I am even more attached to my dear treasure than I already was in Zurich days. He is my only companion.
The Einsteins settle into a comfortable routine, both working. Albert at the patent office and Mileva at home. They hold regular evening meetings with friends interested in science, calling themselves the Olympia Academy. It is part dinner society, part debating club. One of the members, Maurice Solovine, writes, Mileva would sit in a corner during our meetings, listening attentively. She occasionally joined in. I found her reserved, but intelligent, and clearly more interested in physics than housework. Over the next 5 months, the Einsteins published 2 more papers in Germany's most prestigious scientific journal, the Annalen der Physik. But their success is tempered when they learn Liesel is suffering from scarlet fever. Mileva leaves immediately for her parents' home. Ironically, on the journey she discovers she is pregnant again.
Dear Johnny, it's going quickly, but badly. I'm not feeling well at all. What are you up to, little Johnny? Write me soon, okay? Your poor Dolly.
I am very sorry about what has befallen Liesel. It's so easy to suffer lasting effects from scarlet fever. If only this would pass. As what is the child registered? We must take precautions that problems don't arise for her later.
There is, of course, the very intriguing line in the letter of September 1903, the last mention of Liesel, in which he says, we must be careful that no ill befall her. How is the child registered? And the question of what this registration means is of course, that's the kicker, and it's completely unclear.
The pregnancy and then the loss of Liesel was a really clobbered her. And in some ways, she never recovered from it. And that's understandable.
For me, the fate of Liesel is part of understanding what happened to Mileva at a critical period in her life and in her relationship to Einstein.
Some believe Liesel survives scarlet fever, others that she is adopted. But there is another possibility, that Liesel is taken into the home of Mileva's close girlfriend, Helena Kaufler.
I have about, I think, 70 letters from Mileva Maric to my grandmother, written for 40 years. And my mother, Julka, the daughter of Helene, said to me once, you know, there are in this correspondence some things that it is better that nobody don't know.
On May 14, 1904, a healthy, robust boy is born. They name him Hans Albert. Mileva's father visits them shortly after the birth and offers Albert a handsome dowry.
I didn't marry her for money. I married her because I love her. Because we are one. She is my guardian angel against the sins of life, and especially so in the sciences.
Albert's words are prophetic. 1905 proves an extraordinary year for the Einsteins. 5 papers are submitted for publication. 3 of these will form the most significant concepts of 20th century physics. During the same period, they also review scientific papers. Combined, the sheer volume of work is extraordinary. Albert is 26 and Mileva 30.
This is a great achievement, a very great achievement, a beautiful achievement.
The young Einstein family visit Mileva's parents in Novi Sad, Albert for the first time. It is a much-needed break. Yet, Albert and Mileva continue to work on a particular problem.
It is very possible that they debated about that what is now well known as a formula E equals mc squared. Because soon after they returned, the article only on 3 pages, well known, was sent to Annalen der Physik.
These pages would contain the most eloquent and powerful equation ever produced in the world of physics.
The remarkable thing is that Einstein did these 3 totally disconnected bits of work in 1905, the Brownian motion paper, the photoelectric effect, and the special relativity. But all 3 just marvelous and important pieces of work.
Relativity just said that God doesn't care how fast you're moving. And that sounds simple, but vast consequences flow from that. It means the clocks can speed up and slow down. Yardsticks can shrink and contract depending on how they're moving according to you. And of course, the biggest consequence was that energy and matter are in some sense the same. E equals mc squared. And this, of course, led us to the atomic age.
There is the question of, could he have done all of this work as well as holding his job all by himself with no additional help?
He seemed very often to need to think out loud, to express his ideas, to clarify his own ideas by speaking to somebody else about those ideas. And Mileva Maric was pretty clearly the first person who played that role. And in many ways, it was a crucial role, but it is the role of a sounding board which resonates with something that is imposed on it, doesn't create anything. And that's what I think the word sounding board means, something that's sympathetic and can pick up the frequency and sound it back, but doesn't create anything.
What are the facts? The facts are that there are about a dozen statements in Albert Einstein's own hand stating that they were collaborating on our theory, our work on the relative motion.
Further evidence of Mileva's collaboration emerges from an unexpected source. Desanka Trubovich, the first biographer to write about Mileva Maric, learns that Abraham Yoffe, a renowned Russian scientist, cited both Albert's and Mileva's name on the original manuscripts submitted for publication in 1905.
It was a little bit complicated to get the microfilm from the Library of Moscow, and so I watched around in the ETH to find the machine, the reading machine, and we have been sitting, my mother and me, sitting on this machine, turning page after page, and she has been, of course, nervous, waiting to find exactly that. And myself, who speaks Russian, I have found it. I said, well, here it is, on the page 57.
What Trubovich means in her analysis, where she says that that they wrote the electrodynamics of moving bodies together, the special relativity, and where she gives a very elaborate story about how Joffe saw the manuscript with the names Einstein-Maric. I don't believe this story, and when we looked in the for the Joffe reference, we never found it in the Russian original.
It is exactly this place here, the signature, double signature Einstein-Maric, and then in breaks here Maric, that was the family name of his first wife.
From January 1903, they were together day and night. That's 2.5 years, but before then they were together for years, 5 years, 6 years, in close contact. To me, it's simply plausible that there was a collaboration.
Hans Albert told me that his mother and father used to work at the same table. They debated, calculated, and read and write about science problems.
But the question remains, why was Mileva's name removed when the papers were published?
The 1905 manuscript disappeared, as in fact did most of the early manuscript. He was not a man who looked after his own immortality or even his own remnants. However, during the war, during World War II, he was persuaded to rewrite the paper. And Miss Lucas sat down and dictated it to him in order that it then be auctioned off for war bonds. And she told me the story that he refused to write it that way because he said, I could have said it much more conveniently. And she said, no, 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 you must write it just the way you did before.
9 years after completing his degree, Einstein is offered the position as Professor of Theoretical Physics at Zurich University in 1909. He has come full circle.
Dear Helena, Albert now belongs to the circle of the most outstanding physicists of German origin. I'm very happy about his success, which he really deserves. I never miss the opportunity to listen to his lectures.
Indeed, Mileva actually prepares some of Einstein's lectures. On July 28, 1910, the Einsteins have a second son, Eduard, affectionately known as Teddy. 8 months later, the couple travel to attend a science conference and send an amusing postcard to their friends who are looking after the children.
Only contact us if the house burns down.
Sadly, this would be the last of their happy times together. Albert's rise to fame takes its toll on his personal life. They have now been together for 16 years.
Dear Helena, my big Albert is now very famous. Albert has devoted himself completely to physics, and it seems to me that he has little time, if any, for the family.
Albert had fallen in love with Mileva when he was only 18, and as his fame increases, he begins to feel the restrictions of domestic life.
She was more interesting to Einstein when she was a fellow scientist than as suddenly now a nagging housewife who complained when he went off to conferences and left her behind.
And then Albert is offered a job in Germany, in Berlin. And Mileva is very opposed to his taking the job, and he takes it anyway. And she goes to Berlin to help him set up housekeeping. And she suffers terribly there.
What Albert did not tell Mileva was that the object of an earlier infatuation lived there. His first cousin, Elsa.
Dear Elsa, I have to have someone to love, otherwise life is miserable. What I wouldn't give to be able to spend a few days with you, but without my cross. I treat my wife as an employee that I cannot fire.
Being in Germany wasn't bad enough for Mileva, but by that time, Einstein had become really quite unreasonable and almost Germanic, if you will. He gave Mileva this very sort of strict set of rules that she had to abide by in order to have the honor of staying with him in Berlin, including, you know, she could only speak when spoken to. She had to leave the room if he was busy and didn't want her there. She had to speak respectfully to him in front of the children, serve up 3 meals a day. I mean, this was literally kind of a list of requirements that he handed her.
Albert's new mistress and stringent set of rules for the household finally drive his wife and their 2 children away. The farewell is emotional. Albert is in tears. Mileva leaves, believing he will follow her back to Switzerland, but history would intervene. Separated by World War I, Mileva suffers severe financial difficulties trying to raise the 2 young boys alone in Zurich. She is only 39, but her health begins to deteriorate.
For Mileva, having attached herself to one of the greatest scientific minds of the 20th century, it was an enormous loss, that loss of any scientific connection.
Albert is furious when Mileva refuses to give in to his demands for a divorce. It would take 5 long, painful years before Albert promises Mileva the entire proceeds of any future Nobel Prize in return for his freedom. When Albert is awarded the prize in 1921, Mileva buys an apartment building in Zurich.
He tried to keep the fact that he had given the Nobel Prize money to her a secret. He even went to the extreme of transferring the money from the Swedish krona into German marks, and then from there into Swiss marks, which meant an extra sizable loss.
I'm not sure which took longer, the war or my divorce.
But Albert's hard-won freedom is short-lived. Just months after the divorce, he marries Elsa. In time, he visits Mileva and his maturing sons frequently.
I am sending the boys a collection of Brazilian butterflies and, although somewhat difficult to transport, some cacti for you.
The years of bitter acrimony are over, and Mileva and Albert would correspond for the rest of their lives.
Thank you for the photograph.
The good ship Portland brings a distinguished German visitor.
In 1933, Einstein, with Elsa and secretary Helen Dukas, arrive in the United States.
With the doctor is Frau Einstein, who takes care of them as though he were a baby.
Princeton University offers the Nobel Prize-winning scientist the position of research professor at the newly created Institute for Advanced Study. He accepts and will never return to Europe. As Einstein begins a new life in America, his youngest son, Eduard, is diagnosed with schizophrenia. Mileva's finances are severely strained, providing her son with the best medical care possible. She can't bear the thought of having Eduard committed, and at times employs a bodyguard to protect herself against his violent outbursts. Another world war looms. Mileva says goodbye to her eldest son, Hans Albert, and his new wife, who leave for the safety of America. She tries to maintain a semblance of normality, but is burdened by her son's illness. In 1948, Eduard has another violent episode. Mileva is alone with him.
The very end for her comes on one of many nights when he has had a psychotic episode and has started to smash everything in the room. Mileva has a nervous breakdown herself. She's hospitalized. She's completely beside herself. She's constantly calling for the nurses. She's pressing the buzzer for the nurses so much that they finally disconnect the buzzer after having pleaded to be sent to Burgholzli, which is the sanitarium where her son was periodically committed. And I suspect she wanted to go there because she knew that that's where Edward was.
Suffering a series of strokes, Mileva dies alone 3 months later, in August 1948.
To her, love was committing. That's also the Slav soul. Integrity and loyalty. Einstein was more relative when it came to his love and to his love promises. To her, it was the only man, and she loved him to the end.
She confided her disappointment with the human side of Albert Einstein. She said she's like a shell, and Einstein is a pearl in the shell. And when the pearl is finished, complete, then the pearl don't need more the shell.
Mileva is my guardian angel against the sins of life. Without her, I would never have started my work, and certainly not have finished it.
So I knew what was happening. It was the archive being carried away, and that was it. And the next day they were in Jerusalem.
Buried deep within these vast archives was an unpublished manuscript. This led to the discovery of secret love letters written by Einstein to a first wife, who was also a physicist. When finally made public at a major North American science convention, the content of these letters rocked the international science community.
And I found these historians who were having a violent argument about whether Einstein's first wife, Mileva Maric, had somehow been cheated out of the credit for inventing relativity. And I was stunned.
In 1955, Albert Einstein, hailed as the greatest scientific mind of the 20th century, died. For the next 26 years, Einstein's literary estate lay guarded in the basement of Princeton's Fould Hall. The sentinel was Einstein's loyal secretary of 50 years, Helen Dukas. A condition of Einstein's will was that upon her death, all his papers, some 45,000, would go to Hebrew University in Jerusalem.
It was a dark and rainy night in December, and I happened to be just coming out of my office on my way home, and I saw this convoy of trucks drive up to the Institute, and some heavily armed Israeli soldiers with them. Then they rushed up the stairs, and big boxes began coming down the elevator, and the soldiers began loading them onto the trucks.
Education. Her father gave her the best education possible in Serbia at that time.
Miloš obtained special permission from the government for Mileva to attend the all-boys Royal Classical Gymnasium in Zagreb. Here she is able to study mathematics and physics, subjects not available to young girls.
She was trying to break barriers in mathematics and science in a way that women and girls certainly just did not do.
Mileva matriculates, topping her class with the highest marks in physics and maths. Her next stop is Switzerland.
Women were not admitted to most universities in Europe, so Zurich was one of the few options she had.
Mileva enrolls in one of Europe's leading technical universities in Switzerland. The only woman in a class of 5. She decides to specialize in theoretical physics. Only one other person does the same, the young Albert Einstein. As the only 2 students taking the subject, it was inevitable the forces of attraction would be strong.
He's clearly fascinated by her. She speaks of being from the land of pepper, Pfefferland, and it's clear that he enjoyed her, to some degree, her exotic character. But the important thing is the toughness and the independence, the fact that they were 2 Bohemians against a Philistine world.
He sort of grew up surrounded by these kind of bourgeois, stuffy women that he was always complaining about. And well, fluffy people. So suddenly, here was this woman, Mileva, a serious intellectual science student, and he'd never seen anything like this before.
It is a time of great intellectual ferment in the world of physics. The marvel of electricity is new to the world. Big business is pouring money into research institutes. The race is on to discover the laws of natural phenomena.
Electricity at the turn of the century was sort of like computers are now. It was the hot new technology. Everybody wanted to be a player. Everybody wanted to use it and make money out of it. Nobody actually knew yet exactly what it was. They didn't know what matter was made out of. They didn't know what light was.
I don't think the structure of the human skull is to be blamed for man's inability to understand the concept of infinity. He would certainly be able to understand it if, when young, and while developing his sense of perception, he were allowed to venture out into the universe.
Mileva Maric was born on the 19th of December 1875 in Hungary, in the small town of Titel on the outskirts of Novi Sad. Her father is a civil servant and prosperous landowner. Mileva, born with a congenital dislocation of the hip, is painfully shy but exceptionally gifted. A teacher tells her father, "Watch that child. She is a rare phenomenon."
She must have been, in many ways, a very remarkable young woman coming from a sort of backwater area of the Balkans, Vojvodina, which at that time was part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. She had the encouragement of her father, and it seems very often at that time that there had to be a father who was pushing for a young woman to get advanced education.